It was the kind of morning that didn't foreshadow anything special. Gray clouds over the courthouse, coffee cups steaming on benches, lawyers in dark suits reviewing notes. But inside courtroom 7B, a buzz stirred as news spread like wildfire. Chuck Norris had just entered the building, and not as a witness, not as a celebrity guest, but as a defense attorney. The security guards gave each other curious glances as Chuck walked in with quiet confidence, wearing his trademark stoicism and a light denim shirt under a dark jacket. No tie, no briefcase, no entourage, just him and an old man by his side, Jacob Dusty Murdoch, a rancher accused of defrauding an oil company and laundering money through cattle auctions. The courtroom filled quickly. Reporters elbowed each other for seats. Spectators leaned forward, phones hidden in coat pockets, already breaking court rules to snap photos. The door opened with a creak, and in walked the judge, Honorable Harold Wentworth, known for being no-nonsense and delighting in verbal sparring. He took his seat slowly, surveying the room like a king arriving at court. Then his eyes landed on Chuck. He blinked, did a double take, and a thin smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Mr. Norris," the judge said, voice syrupy with sarcasm, "it's an honor. I trust your credentials are in order." Chuck nodded. "I passed the bar like everyone else, Your Honor." "I see," the judge replied, tapping his pen against the gavel. "And you plan to represent your client without assistance?" "Yes." "No co-counsel, no paralegal, no documents?" "Correct." A few stifled laughs echoed from the prosecution's bench. Chuck stood silently, arms loosely crossed, waiting for the pageantry to finish. From the left table, Clive Renner, the state prosecutor, sleek suit, slick back hair, Harvard degree, gave Chuck a smug glance. "We assumed you'd be testifying about a movie, not practicing law, but we're happy to proceed." The judge chuckled, clearly enjoying himself. "Mr. Norris, let me remind you, this is not a film set. There will be no explosions, no slow-motion martial arts. Just facts, logic, and the law." Chuck gave him a tight-lipped nod. "Understood, Your Honor." "Good. Then let's not delay. Mr. Renner, your opening statement." Renner rose with the confidence of someone already polishing his victory speech. He launched into a carefully worded explanation of how Mr. Murdoch, despite his weathered appearance and slow drawl, had been at the center of an elaborate financial scam. He painted a picture of forged invoices, falsified documents, and shady wire transfers that pointed back to the old man's ranch in Amarillo. The jury listened closely. Chuck didn't blink. "Ladies and gentlemen," Renner said, pacing with practiced rhythm, "this may look like a case about cattle and fences, but make no mistake, this is organized fraud. And justice demands we hold everyone accountable, no matter how many miles of dust and folklore lie between us and the truth." He sat down, confident, proud. "Done." The judge nodded. "Mr. Norris, your response?" Chuck stood slowly, walked toward the jury box, and turned to face the judge. "Before I begin, Your Honor, I'd like to make one request." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Already? We haven't even started. What is it?" "I'd like to waive the use of notes." That earned audible murmurs from the crowd. The judge frowned. "I beg your pardon? I won't be referring to written statements or documents during my defense." "And why would you do that?" the judge asked, genuinely baffled. "I memorized everything I need." The room fell silent. "Everything," the judge echoed. "You memorized the entire case file?" Chuck nodded. "Every invoice, transcript, and motion filed. Every statement. I can even quote the prosecution's exhibits by number." Clive Renner blinked, unsure if this was some stunt or if Chuck was actually serious. "I hope you're not trying to create a scene," the judge said cautiously. "Because if you're intending to waste the court's time—" "I'm not, Your Honor," Chuck replied evenly. "I just prefer to keep things in my head." The judge sighed, muttered something under his breath, and waved a hand. "Fine, we'll allow it. But don't expect leniency when the real questions start flying." Chuck walked back to his table, calm and collected. He didn't ruffle papers or shuffle folders. He just stood there, waiting. The judge leaned into the clerk and whispered with a grin, "Get ready to take notes. This is going to be something." The jury exchanged uncertain looks. The bailiff rolled her eyes. Chuck said nothing. The judge cleared his throat. "Proceed when ready, Mr. Norris." Chuck nodded once. He looked to the jury and began to speak, not loudly, not theatrically, but with clarity and poise that immediately captured attention. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't try to charm the room. He got right to it. This case rests on the assumption that my client, a 74-year-old cattleman who has never owned a computer, somehow orchestrated a multi-state financial conspiracy. We're going to break down that assumption piece by piece. He paused. But not today. Today, I want you to look at something much simpler: motive. He let the word hang in the air. Why would Dusty Murdoch, who still uses a rotary phone, suddenly become a criminal mastermind? Because he got greedy? Because he learned to launder money through cattle auctions? Chuck looked directly at Clive. Or because someone wanted to frame him? The courtroom stiffened. The judge tapped his pen. "Stick to opening remarks, Mr. Norris." Chuck nodded. Of course. And then, to everyone's surprise, he didn't overreach. He didn't grandstand. He wrapped it up in under 5 minutes. "I look forward to presenting the truth," Chuck said plainly. "Not with flash, just with facts." He sat down. The judge glanced at him with a curious expression, part surprise, part amusement. The rest of the morning passed with witness prep and clerical formalities. But something had shifted. The courtroom was still, watching Chuck not as a novelty, but as an anomaly. He hadn't cracked a joke, hadn't thrown a punchline, but something in the way he carried himself hinted that he was more than the cowboy caricature they had assumed. By lunchtime, Clive Renner had reviewed his notes 3 times. He wasn't worried, not yet, but he wasn't laughing anymore either. The judge reclined in his chambers, sipping lukewarm coffee, trying to replay Chuck's expressionless delivery. And Chuck, he was eating a sandwich in the courthouse hallway, sitting cross-legged on a bench, talking softly to Dusty about the weather in Amarillo, as if nothing was riding on the trial at all. But inside that calm, something sharp was waiting to be unleashed. The next morning, the courtroom buzzed with a different kind of energy. The reporters had done their work overnight. Headlines ranged from Chuck Norris defends rancher in bizarre courtroom turn to roundhouse to the rulebook. Norris goes legal. Most of them assumed it was a gimmick. A few suspected more. But no one, not even Judge Wentworth, was ready for what came next. At precisely 9 a.m., Chuck entered the courtroom with the same calm he'd shown the day before. No flashy entrance. No entourage. Just a man and a mission. Dusty followed behind, wide-brim hat in his hands, looking out of place among the sharp suits and polished shoes. "All rise," the bailiff called. Everyone stood. The judge entered, adjusted his robe, and gave a quick nod. "Let's begin," he said, eyeing Chuck carefully. Clive Renner wasted no time. He called his first witness, an accountant who claimed Dusty's ranch had mysteriously received inflated payments from a defunct oil supplier, payments that coincided with fake livestock invoices. The accountant laid out the numbers with professional flair, pointing to charts and printed spreadsheets entered as evidence. "The transactions," he explained, "follow a clear pattern of false billing and money laundering, consistent with other known fraud cases." Renner glanced smugly at Chuck, expecting him to fold. But Chuck didn't blink. When it was time to cross-examine, he stood and approached slowly, like he was lining up a shot that didn't need to be rushed. "Mr. Talbot," Chuck said to the accountant, "you're a CPA?" "Yes." "Licensed in Texas?" "Yes." "How many fraud cases have you worked on personally?" 32. "And in how many of those did you investigate ranches?" 2. "Of those 2, how many involved clients who didn't own a computer?" The accountant hesitated. "None." Chuck nodded, slow and deliberate. "So you've never seen a fraud scheme run entirely on paper ledgers and landline calls?" "No, sir." Chuck turned to the jury. "Interesting." Renner stood up. "Objection, commentary." "Sustained," the judge said automatically. But the seed was already planted. Chuck continued, "Could you tell me, Mr. Talbot, when the first suspicious payment was made?" Talbot rifled through his papers. "August 18th, 2023. Chuck nodded. And are you aware that Dusty Murdoch was hospitalized that entire week following gallbladder surgery? Another pause. I wasn't informed of that. Chuck lifted a single page from the court evidence pile, Exhibit 12B, already submitted by the prosecution, and read it aloud. For Methodist Plains Hospital, admittance date, August 15th, discharge, August 22nd. Under sedation for 3 of those days. The jury stirred. Even the judge sat forward slightly. Just to clarify, Chuck continued, voice calm. You're accusing a man of orchestrating a wire fraud scheme while he was under general anesthesia? Well, I wasn't responsible for the timeline research, Talbot stammered. Chuck's voice remained steady. Yet you swore under oath that the evidence followed a clear pattern, did you not? The accountant looked like he wanted to melt into the witness box. Yes, but no further questions. Chuck sat down. The courtroom was dead quiet. Judge Wentworth broke the silence with a dry cough and motioned for the next witness. This one was an oil executive named Bradford Lee, the man whose company had allegedly been defrauded. He wore a tailored suit and a smug expression. Renner guided him gently, like a prize show dog, and Lee explained how he discovered suspicious inconsistencies in invoice logs and payment batches that had Dusty's Ranch as the common recipient. Chuck watched with eagle-eyed precision. When it was his turn, he rose slowly, walked to the witness stand, and asked one question. Mr. Lee, have you ever been to Amarillo? The man frowned. I don't see how that's relevant. It is if you're claiming first-hand knowledge of operations on a ranch you've never set foot on. Lee straightened in his seat. No, I haven't. My analysts handled the investigation. Chuck stepped closer. Analysts from your company? Yes. Your company, which just 6 months ago filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy? Renner stood. Objection irrelevant. Sustained, the judge said, but now he was listening more closely. Chuck wasn't fazed. Mr. Lee, are you familiar with the name Daniel Croft? Lee hesitated. Yes. He was our chief operations officer. Chuck turned to the court clerk. Your Honor, I'd like to submit Exhibit 21, an email thread between Mr. Lee and Mr. Croft, dated July 30th, 2023. The clerk retrieved it. Go ahead, the judge said, now clearly intrigued. Chuck read aloud. Daniel, we need a diversion. Anything to keep the board off our backs while we restructure. Something rural. Something small. Lee's face drained of color. Renner stood again. Objection. This wasn't in our exhibit list. Chuck raised a hand. This email was part of a document dump from opposing counsel. Page 412. The judge looked at Renner. Is that true? Renner muttered. It's buried in the attachments. Chuck turned back to the jury. So the prosecution's own client sent internal emails requesting a diversion. And weeks later, out of nowhere, an elderly rancher who had never seen a bank app becomes the scapegoat for a multi-layered fraud scheme. He let the silence linger. And no one's ever been to his ranch. No one confirmed the livestock count. No one noticed that the so-called invoice numbers Chuck flipped to a page were actually outdated DMV registration numbers from 2011. He walked to the projection screen. This, Your Honor, is the invoice listed in Exhibit 7. Notice the serial code? 4TX 99113. He clicked a remote, and an image appeared of a rusted-out truck in Dusty's barn with that exact plate number. A truck that hadn't moved in over a decade. Ladies and gentlemen, Chuck said, turning to the jury, the only laundering that happened here was someone laundering the truth. The courtroom was stunned. Renner looked like he wanted to object, but couldn't find a reason that wouldn't make it worse. Judge Wentworth leaned back in his chair, rubbing his jaw with one hand. Chuck looked toward Dusty, who gave him the smallest nod. Eyes misty, hands gripping his hat like it was a lifeline. Defense rests, Chuck said, voice low but firm. The judge glanced down at his notes, then up at the jury, then back at Chuck. He was quiet for a long moment, then said, Court is adjourned for today. We'll reconvene tomorrow at 10 a.m. The gavel struck. People didn't stand immediately. It was like they had to process what just happened. Chuck turned to Dusty. Ready to go? The old man chuckled. Son, I don't even know what you just did, but it felt like you just knocked out the whole room with one swing. Chuck smiled for the first time all day. I didn't need to fight. I just needed to listen. And with that, he helped Dusty to his feet and walked him out, calm, quiet, deadly precise, like a man who didn't need applause to know he just won the war. The morning of the final day in court felt like the calm before a storm. There was an undercurrent of tension in the air that hadn't been there before. The gallery was packed as usual, but today the room felt different. Whispers buzzed in every corner. Reporters and spectators alike were waiting for the final act. Would Chuck Norris really pull this off? Would the judge go along with his unorthodox tactics? Or was this just some elaborate trick? Chuck Norris arrived, as he had every day, unassuming and calm. He wasn't wearing a suit, but a well-worn leather jacket and boots, a stark contrast to the stiff, polished forms of the prosecution and the judge. He sat beside Dusty, who now looked far more confident, having seen his defense lawyer slowly dismantle the case bit by bit. Judge Wentworth entered the courtroom, and as always, the room rose. He looked more serious than usual, as if aware that the situation was spiraling out of his control. He took his seat, and for a brief moment his eyes met Chuck's. There was no condescension now, no sarcasm in the gaze, just a flicker of something deeper, respect. But he quickly hid it behind his trademark stern expression. "Let's proceed," Wentworth said, his voice still commanding, though there was an edge of hesitation there. Chuck stood slowly, walking toward the podium with the same measured pace he had all trial. He didn't carry a file, didn't need one. His mind was the only tool he needed. The jury was already whispering to each other. They could sense the tension, the weight of the decision they were about to make. Clive Renner, who had been riding high on his own overconfidence throughout the trial, sat a little straighter now, glancing nervously from Chuck to the judge. He had no idea what was coming, but something about the way Chuck carried himself told him this wasn't going to be easy. "I'm ready, Your Honor," Chuck said simply. Wentworth nodded, though his eyes narrowed. "Proceed, Mr. Norris. But let's keep it focused." Chuck didn't flinch. He took a deep breath, turned to the jury, and began. "The case before you is not as complex as it's been made to seem," Chuck said, his voice ringing clear across the courtroom. "We've heard a lot of legal jargon, a lot of accusations, but the heart of the matter is simple. Who benefited from this scheme?" He let the question hang in the air. "You've heard how the prosecution alleges that Dusty Murdoch orchestrated a complex fraud involving an oil company, fictitious livestock invoices, and money laundering. But have we really seen any solid evidence to support that?" He paused. The room hung on his every word. Clive Renner, in his opening statement, said that this was a case of fraud so obvious it was practically etched in stone. But where are the actual fraud documents? Where are the witnesses who can say they saw Dusty Murdoch committing these acts? Chuck looked at Renner, and for the first time in the trial, there was no joking, no sarcasm, just a pointed, calculating look. Renner shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Chuck turned back to the jury. "The fact is, there are none. Not one person came to the stand to testify they saw my client committing these alleged crimes. No one saw him sign anything fraudulent. No one saw him transfer money illegally. And, most importantly, no one presented a shred of proof that he even knew the exact nature of these supposed transactions." Chuck's words were deliberate, cutting through the noise in the courtroom. It wasn't bravado or showmanship. It was legal precision, each word landing with the force of a hammer. He continued, "Instead, we've heard speculation. We've heard accusations. But we haven't seen the evidence that proves beyond a reasonable doubt that Dusty Murdoch is guilty." Chuck shifted his focus back to the heart of the case, the oil company's supposed financial losses. "Now, let's talk about the real motive here. I've shown you emails between Bradford Lee and Daniel Croft. The prosecution tried to dismiss them as irrelevant, but those emails clearly show a plan to divert attention from a far bigger problem facing their company: financial ruin. The diversion they set up? Dusty Murdoch, a simple rancher, someone who doesn't even know how to navigate an online banking system." He smiled slightly, almost in irony. "And that's the person you're supposed to believe masterminded a multi-state fraud scheme?" The jury exchanged glances. Some of them were nodding ever so slightly. Chuck's calm demeanor and methodical breakdown of the case was having its intended effect. Chuck's gaze shifted to the judge now. "Your Honor," he said, his voice still level but carrying an undeniable weight, "we've been operating under the assumption that everything in this case was cut and dry. That because my client is an older man from a small town, he must be guilty of something he doesn't even understand. But if you look at the facts, the real facts, it becomes clear this is nothing more than a scapegoating operation." Judge Wentworth's eyes flickered as he leaned forward. He was still composed, but there was a tension in his posture now. He hadn't expected Chuck to cut through the case this cleanly. He hadn't expected Chuck to highlight the exact weaknesses in the prosecution's theory with such calm precision. But Chuck wasn't done yet. He turned to the jury again. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said, "this case has been about one thing: distraction. The prosecution wanted to distract you from the truth, and that truth is that they've had no case from the beginning. They've wasted your time, your patience, and your trust on a baseless set of accusations against a man who, frankly, hasn't done anything wrong." He let his words sink in. "The question you need to ask yourselves is simple. Who has something to gain from this? Is it the rancher who's been accused? Or is it the executives who've been caught in a financial mess they can't fix?" The answer is clear. He paused, looking at each juror in turn. The tension in the room was palpable now. Even Judge Wentworth seemed to be holding his breath. Dusty Murdoch is not guilty. He never was. Chuck lowered his gaze to the table, his hands clasped in front of him. "Your Honor," Chuck said, his tone still firm, "we respectfully request a verdict of not guilty. Based on the complete lack of evidence and the clear manipulation of the facts presented to this court, we ask that you bring justice not to the people who've been falsely accused, but to those who've tried to bend this system for their own gain." He took one last long breath. "Thank you." Chuck sat down. The room was silent. For a long moment, no one moved. The tension was thick, palpable, like the air before a thunderstorm. Everyone was waiting for the next move. The judge sat back, his fingers tapping lightly on the edge of his bench. His eyes were sharp, calculating, but there was no smugness, no trace of the mockery that had defined his behavior at the beginning of the trial. Instead, there was something else, an acknowledgement of the fact that Chuck had just torn the case apart in a way no one had anticipated. He was no longer just the action hero in the courtroom. He was a master strategist, one who had used his knowledge, patience, and calm to expose the weakness of the prosecution's case. Finally, Judge Wentworth cleared his throat. "The jury will now deliberate." The gavel came down. The courtroom was a pressure cooker, the air thick with anticipation. The gavel had just come down, and the jury had retreated into deliberations. The silence that followed felt almost oppressive. The usual bustle of reporters, lawyers, and spectators had been replaced with hushed whispers and expectant glances. Everyone knew the stakes, not just for Dusty, but for Chuck Norris, the man who had unexpectedly transformed from a mere character in an action film to a master strategist in the real world. The clock ticked slowly. Each minute that passed felt like an eternity. Chuck sat quietly beside Dusty, his demeanor unchanged. Dusty, on the other hand, was a mix of nervousness and disbelief. The old rancher had spent most of the trial wondering how he had gotten into this mess, and now, in the final moments, he was holding his breath, unsure whether the past week would bring justice or leave him in a prison cell. The jury deliberated for just over 2 hours, a relatively short time for such a complex case. The prosecutor, Clive Renner, had gone to his office, fuming in frustration, convinced that Chuck's unorthodox defense had been nothing more than smoke and mirrors. He had spent the better part of the last few days scrambling, trying to salvage what he could of his case. But deep down, he knew he had lost. The facts weren't in his favor, and his strategy had fallen apart under the weight of Chuck's brilliance. Finally, the door to the jury room opened. A bailiff stepped inside and motioned for the court to be ready. The room fell into an almost ceremonial silence as the 12 jurors filed in, their faces a mixture of exhaustion and resolve. Judge Wentworth glanced up from his papers and cleared his throat. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" he asked, his voice almost imperceptible in the quiet. One of the jurors, a woman with short brown hair, stood up. She had been one of the more serious faces in the jury box during the trial. Her eyes met Chuck's for a brief moment, a silent acknowledgement of what had transpired over the past days. "We have, Your Honor," she said, her voice firm but measured. "We find the defendant, Dusty Murdoch, not guilty on all charges." The words hung in the air like a burst of sunlight breaking through a dark cloud. The room seemed to exhale collectively, as if the tension that had built over the past week had finally been released. Some jurors exchanged quiet nods. Others smiled faintly, but most were simply relieved it was over. Chuck Norris' face remained stoic, though a small, satisfied smile tugged at the corners of his lips. He turned to Dusty, whose face went from disbelief to overwhelming relief. The rancher stood up shakily, his hands trembling as he reached out to shake Chuck's hand. "Thank you, Chuck," Dusty whispered. I don't know what I would have done without you." Chuck gripped Dusty's hand firmly, a brief but genuine exchange of understanding. "You did your part, Dusty. I just made sure they saw the truth." Judge Wentworth leaned forward, his gavel raised, ready to deliver his usual directive to the courtroom. But today his voice was quieter, and there was a pause before the sharp crack of the gavel echoed through the room. "Case dismissed," Wentworth declared, though there was no triumph in his voice. Instead, his words carried a quiet, almost reluctant finality. He hadn't expected this outcome. He hadn't expected Chuck Norris to not just win the case, but to expose the very flaws in the prosecution's approach with such precision and skill. This wasn't some action-packed courtroom drama. This was a real, hard-hitting legal victory. The courtroom erupted into a mix of reactions. Dusty's family, who had been anxiously watching from the back, stood up and cheered softly. There were even a few murmurs of approval from the reporters who had been closely following the trial. No one was surprised by the outcome in the sense that Chuck's strategy was sound, but they were surprised by the sheer brilliance with which he executed it. Renner, however, stood frozen. His jaw was clenched, and his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. It had been a long time since he'd been bested in such a way, and he couldn't fathom how a man who had never appeared in a courtroom before could dismantle his carefully constructed case so effortlessly. Renner's eyes burned with resentment as he looked across the room at Chuck, who was calmly shaking hands with a jury forewoman, the woman who had been the first to speak. Judge Wentworth, sensing the tension, stood up slowly, the gavel still in his hand. He paused, looking down at the papers before him, then up at Chuck. "Mr. Norris," he said, his voice now carrying more weight than it had during the entire trial. I must admit, you've done something here I didn't expect." Chuck stood and met the judge's gaze squarely. There was no boastfulness in his expression, only a quiet sense of purpose. "You've made a mockery of this trial, Mr. Norris," Wentworth continued, his voice no longer carrying the biting sarcasm it had in the early days. "I mocked you, I doubted you, and I presumed I knew better. But I can't deny the skill and precision with which you've handled this case." Chuck inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the judge's words without pride, just as a man who had done his job well. "I don't seek your approval, Judge," Chuck said, his voice calm. "I only seek the truth. And I think today we found it." Wentworth blinked, almost surprised by the simplicity of Chuck's response. For the first time, he realized how far removed he had been from what truly mattered, the facts, the law, the pursuit of justice. He had been so caught up in his role as an authority figure that he had forgotten the core of his job, to see justice served, not to win a game of egos. I'm sorry, Mr. Norris," Wentworth muttered, more to himself than to Chuck. He cleared his throat again. "Your client is free to go, and I suppose in some ways so is my pride." The courtroom was silent again. There was no triumphant music, no applause. Just the quiet, respectful nods exchanged between those who had witnessed something remarkable. As Chuck and Dusty walked out of the courtroom, Chuck's calm, confident strides led the way. Dusty was still in shock, but there was a lightness to his steps now, a weight lifted from his shoulders. "Guess you're not just a tough guy after all," Dusty said with a grin. Chuck chuckled softly. The toughest thing you can do sometimes is listen and think clearly. That's all I did. And with that, they exited the courtroom. Chuck Norris, the quiet genius, leaving behind a courtroom forever changed by his unshakable resolve and unparalleled intellect.